Final title I'm thinking might be Demon Rising. This is the first chapter, so no explanations needed. Chapter 1, The First Day of Winter. Sabine had chased summer for almost a year. From country to country, continent to continent, she pursued the sun as though it could somehow fill the holes in her spirit, or at the very least cauterize them. Leaving the warmth of Australia for winter in the Netherlands reminded her of her first day of school after break. It seemed as though she'd exchanged freedom for responsibility. She attempted to settle in for the 3 flights it would take to reach Amsterdam. With almost 30 hours of travel time ahead of her, she knew it would be best to relax and get some sleep, but she couldn't get comfortable. She fidgeted and fretted about the direction she wanted her life to take. She loved tattooing, but it was almost time for her to assume a new identity, and with it, a new career. She was excited about the opportunity for a new adventure, but she also mourned everyone and everything she would have to abandon. She was going to miss her first paradise and her friends there. The guys at the tattoo shop had been excited for her when she told them about the convention and art exhibition she would be attending. "You go, girl," Dozer, short for bulldozer, had said. The huge biker, face covered in tattoos, had given her a bear hug, lifting her off her feet. It always amused her how supportive and cuddly a group of scary-looking tattooists could be. They had no idea that the goodbye had been final. She continued to squirm in her chair. The in-flight entertainment system offered very little solace for her growing ambivalence. Towards the end of the second flight, she began to feel off, nauseous and achy, as if she were coming down with the flu. She assured herself that she was merely anxious because she hated flying. People were not meant to be crammed together in uncomfortable seats for hours on end, or hurtling at breakneck speed through the air. The kid behind her, inadvertently kicking her seat, didn't help either. But at least he wasn't screaming anymore. Sabine cradled a cup full of ginger ale in her hands, periodically sipping it and hoping her stomach would calm down. Without warning, her nose exploded blood. Flustered, she snatched the damp cocktail napkins off her tray table and pressed them to her face. Definitely the result of being trapped in pressurized tubes full of dry, recycled air for almost 24 hours, she thought, as if long flights didn't suck enough. The thick, red fluid swirled in slow motion as the carbonization rose to the surface of the now tainted drink. She watched the concoction bubble, both disgusted and fascinated, as her nose continued to gush. Blood ran from her face, through a wad of gore-drenched paper, and down her arm. Tiny cocktail napkins were not going to be enough to staunch the flow. Droplets spattered to the floor with a soft thwap thwap, almost drowned out by the mechanical hum of the airplane. "Damn it," she muttered as she leapt from her chair and headed for the lavatory. People cringed out of the way with looks of horror, sympathy, and disgust as they waved her to the front of the line for the bathroom. She returned to her seat a few minutes later, clutching a giant wad of toilet paper. She bled through it, and then proceeded to soak all the tissues in her carry-on, and then the stack of paper towels the flight attendant gave her. She couldn't remember ever having had a nosebleed this bad. In fact, she hadn't had a nosebleed since she was 5, and that time she'd been kicked in the face. She remembered the incident clearly. She had accidentally revealed to the other children that she wasn't entirely human. She'd only just been learning to control her magic. She knew she wasn't supposed to play outside without the amulet her uncle had given her to help her maintain her disguise. She thought it had been a minor slip-up when her illusion partially dissipated, but her eyes turned bright purple when her fangs had reappeared. When the other kids noticed her transformation, they surrounded her, calling her a spawn of Satan and evil. They threw rocks at her, and when she tried to fight back, a couple of the bigger boys knocked her down, then kicked her repeatedly. When the rest of the children joined in, Sabine curled into a ball in the wet grass, trying to ward off any more blows to the face or stomach. She never again showed her true nature in public. The flight attendant startled her out of the memory. "We'll be landing in about an hour. You think it will require medical attention? We can radio ahead to the airport for assistance." He handed her yet another batch of paper towels, his brow furrowed. Concern or revulsion? Sabine couldn't tell. "No, thank you very much. I'll be just fine. This should end soon." She tried to sound unconcerned, but feared she wasn't coming off as entirely convincing. The last thing she wanted was medical attention. An examination could easily lead to detention, or worse. She shuddered at the thought. Sabine stuffed wads of bright red paper towels, one after the other, into her barf bag, then turned to the woman in the seat next to her and asked, "May I have this?" The woman flinched as she handed over her vomit bag. People seated near Sabine started to look uncomfortable, edging away expressions of disgust as if she might be contagious. Has anyone ever died of a nosebleed? It must have happened at least once in the history of mankind. The thought only exacerbated discomfort in her already nervous stomach as panic threatened to overtake her. She tried concentrating on her breath. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 6, 7, 8. Her mother had taught Sabine the breathing technique when she was still a small child in order to help her deal with her anxiety. It usually worked. She counted each inhalation and exhalation until a semblance of calm settled over her. It was a full 45 minutes before the hemorrhaging finally subsided. Sabine took stock of herself. There was blood on her shirt and hands. She tried her best to clean them with the last of the paper towels and then put on a sweater over the stained top. At least she was no longer nauseous. That was a relief. She still needed to drag her ass and all her equipment to Amsterdam, which meant one more connecting flight when she landed at Heathrow Airport. There was no time in her schedule to be sick. Here you go. This should make you feel a bit better. The flight attendant placed a small tray in front of her. Thank you. She found it ironic that he had brought her orange juice and cookies, as though she had donated the blood voluntarily. Sabine never gave blood. She had lied to friends over the years, telling them she was anemic. In truth, she wasn't even sure if she had a known blood type. She drank the juice, ate the cookies, and hoped her nose was done stirring up trouble. The third and final flight to Amsterdam was blessedly free of both screaming children and hemorrhages. She stood on the platform at Schiphol Airport Station and watched her breath turn to fog. If it was this cold underground, how much colder was it outside? She wondered if a tattoo convention, even one as high profile as this one in Amsterdam, was worth leaving the warmth of Australia. The 11:15 arrived. Longing to get out of the cold, she shoved her obscene amount of luggage out of the way of other commuters and slumped into a seat near the door. People shuffled aboard the train, looking rumpled and jet-lagged. They drank coffee from paper cups and studied their phones. Just as the train pulled out of the station, Sabine's nose decided that if it could bleed a pint, why not a quart? A crimson torrent flowed from her face for the second time that day. She leaned over and searched through her carry-on bag, desperate for something to absorb the now free-flowing blood. Nothing. Shit, she muttered under her breath. The dense metallic taste of blood ran down the back of her throat, and she gasped for air through her mouth, the flow too aggressive for her to be able to breathe normally. A ball of angry snakes began to writhe in the pit of her stomach. Was she going to find out how much a person could bleed before they required medical attention? What if she passed out? Her tail twitched, echoing her troubled thoughts. Even though it was concealed under her long coat, her tail was currently invisible. She rifled through her carry-on, looking for her extra socks, underwear, or anything she could use to absorb the blood. Then she noticed a rather large pair of engineer boots standing in the aisle next to her seat. Her eyes flicked up from the Titanic footwear to the person wearing them, an absolute bear of a man. He stood facing her, stooped slightly to keep his head from hitting the ceiling. He held a clean handkerchief extended down in one enormous hand. Thank you. Sabine gratefully took the folded white cloth and pressed it to her nose. You're American, he said, his voice a deep baritone with a rolling Scottish brogue. Try not to hold it against me. She stared up and up at the giant in front of her. He must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, she thought, and so broad that he appeared too large for the scale of the train. Neat blue jeans and a white Oxford shirt peeked out from under his unbuttoned wool overcoat. His belt buckle caught her attention. It was circular and depicted 2 angels on either side of a chalice with a cross above wreathed in holy light. Is it an antique pilgrim's badge? If the badge was real, it dated back to the Middle Ages before the Protestant Reformation. That art history class I took 30 years ago was finally good for something, she thought wryly. I can identify when people hold their trousers up with historical artifacts. Highly useful. Shit, does he think I'm staring at his crotch? Her cheeks went warm and she shifted her gaze to his face. The giant's hair was long, pulled back, and so blonde it was almost white, as were his neatly trimmed beard and mustache. But it was his eyes that held Sabine captivated. They were centrally heterochromatic, gold around the pupil, spiking into a bright blue that reminded her of the Aegean Sea in summer. His gaze locked with hers, and it seemed as though he could see through her disguise. The thought both excited and frightened her. Never show your true nature, she reminded herself. The moment passed. Sabine nodded her head towards the seat across from her, a wordless invitation to sit should he be so inclined. He gingerly folded his frame into a seat made for people far more diminutive. Are you all right? He sounded genuinely concerned. She wondered why she didn't feel at least somewhat lightheaded by this point. I'm okay. I don't think I've ever bled so much in my entire life. This is my second nosebleed today. Apparently, my face objects to trading in surfer's paradise for the Netherlands in the middle of winter. She hoped the flight and sudden climate change were the reason for the horrific nosebleeds. What brings you here then? Business trip. 10 months ago, she had closed her shop, put her belongings in storage, and headed for the airport. The idea had been to make a grand tour of the tattoo world, doing guest spots and shows, see all her friends one last time. The Netherlands was to be the final stop before returning to the US. She adjusted the reddening cloth pressed to her nose. Not that I don't appreciate it, but who carries a handkerchief in this day and age? I fear I may be somewhat anachronistic. Sabine smiled at his choice of words. He didn't look like he could be more than 35. She gestured at his belt buckle. It seems your handkerchief is not your only antiquated wardrobe choice. He shrugged, then extended his hand. Alistair, you and Douglas. Sabine inspected her hand to be sure there was no blood on it, then wiped it on her jeans, just to be certain. His hand dwarfed hers. Sabine Beaumont. She gave him her most winning smile. Her nose had finally stopped bleeding, at least for the moment. She sighed with relief and took a tentative breath. The air smelled like flowers. Not just flowers. There was a green, earthy scent like spring when the sun comes out after it rains. A smell that was totally out of place on a commuter train in the middle of winter. The scent was calming, and she found herself releasing the tension that she'd been holding on to for hours. There was no need to impress a person she would never meet again, but admittedly, she did love to flirt. It was in her nature, and Alistair was rather attractive. Why not have some fun? I've always wanted to visit Scotland. You reckon I'm from Scotland, do you? Alistair, if you were any more Scottish, you'd be wearing a kilt and playing the bagpipes. Alistair grinned. Well, I do own a kilt. I was under the impression that there were bearded men in kilts all over Scotland playing the bagpipes. She gave him a wicked little grin. Oh, aye. They lie in wait round every corner ready to pounce when a tourist walks by. You like bagpipe music? Sabine wrinkled her nose. That's not all bad, Alistair insisted. In fact, some of it's quite good. One of my favourite punk bands has a piper in it. I'm not sure there is such a thing as good bagpipe music, punk band or not. That's because you've not heard the real Mackenzies. Look them up online. I promise you'll not be disappointed. He shifted slightly, and the bench squeaked with displeasure at its oversized occupant. It's hard to be disappointed when I'm starting with such low expectations. I can see you're intending on being prejudiced against it. He grinned as he placed his hand dramatically on his chest. You'll wound me, Miss Beaumont. Sabine laughed. Sometimes Alistair even sounded anachronistic. Perhaps the Netherlands won't be so bad after all, despite the cold. All too soon, the train slowed, and they pulled into Amsterdam Central Station. This is me. Alistair stood up. Sabine glanced at the crumpled, now sanguine handkerchief in her hand, then looked up at him apologetically. Sorry, she murmured, not wishing to hand the soiled cloth back to him. Keep it. He smiled and helped her with her excessive baggage. Will you be needing further assistance with all this? No thanks, I can get it from here. There's an elevator just up the platform. Are you certain you have a fair few bags here? He looked at her with an expression of disbelief. I have a system. She linked two of the suitcases together with a strap so they could be dragged as one unit, shouldered her backpack, and tied her purse to the top of a third piece of luggage. See? No worries. She liked the Australian expression, though it did sound odd with an American accent. She extended her hand. On that kiss, have a good trip. Alistair took her hand in his, but rather than shaking it, he bent forward and kissed the back of it, then turned and strode off down the stairs. A shiver ran through Sabine, and she repressed the sudden urge to follow him. Don't get involved with human men anymore, she reminded herself. It's too complicated. Anyway, Alistair's too young for me. Her tail twitched again, this time in annoyance at her self-imposed rules. She headed for the taxi stand.